What's up, everyone? I'm here with my NFL Week 13 DraftKings picks. Hope all of you guys had a very successful Week 12, and hopefully we can continue to do well moving forward to finish off the last few weeks of this regular season. So let's go ahead and jump into this week's picks. Alright, so moving into our first stack here, we have Matthew Stafford and Theo Riddick, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because anybody in this New Orleans and Detroit game is a pretty obvious play in my opinion. I think I like Stafford a little bit more than Breeze though in this situation because Stafford's offense is a little bit more concentrated than Breeze. Breeze has a lot of options to throw the ball to, as does Stafford, but Stafford likes to narrow down his offense a little bit more, and Breeze also is going to get more help in the running game than Stafford is. I think Stafford is in a very similar situation, in my opinion, as Kirk Cousins was a couple weeks ago against the Green Bay Packers, in the sense that I can envision Stafford moving the ball around a ton and having a very, very good game. So I don't think you have to stack him with somebody. That very well may be a strategy that I use this week in cash games like I did a couple weeks ago with Cousins. I don't know yet. I think I do like Stafford paired with Riddick. Even Marvin Jones makes sense because he's so cheap. You can make a case for Eric Ebron. There's a lot of different guys that you could pair with Stafford and make perfect sense, but I think Stafford is the guy I'm leaning towards a little bit more than Breeze. All right, next up I have Big Ben and Antonio Brown, and this is more of a tournament stack in my opinion. So obviously they're coming off of the long week because they played on Thanksgiving Day, and I'm just really hoping that we can get these guys at a little bit lower ownership than you usually would. First off, I think majority of people are going to be targeting Le'Veon Bell. This is a rare week where Le'Veon Bell is actually more expensive than Antonio Brown. It's only by $100, but he's still more expensive nevertheless. Right now, the Steelers have a very high team total at 27 and a quarter. That's actually the third highest on the slate right now. So hopefully we can get a really high volume offense out of these two. Last week was the first week in over a month that Antonio Brown didn't have double-digit targets. But because of that, he didn't really need them because he only had 6 targets and he had 3 touchdown receptions on those 6 targets. And he did that against Vontae Davis. So Antonio Brown is virtually matchup proof in my opinion. And I mean, it just makes sense to think about these two guys every single week. Have extremely high team total like I mentioned, and because of those reasons, I'm definitely considering these guys in tournaments. I don't think you need to play them in cash. Antonio is obviously a good cash wide receiver every single week, but definitely two guys I'm considering in tournaments. All right, so for our third and final stack, I have Alex Smith and Travis Kelce. Now, I'm looking at this in tournaments once again. I think Travis Kelce is actually going to be a pretty popular play. He's coming off back-to-back 100-yard receiving games. He's still under 5K. And, it looks like the Chiefs are getting him more and more involved in the offense in these past few weeks. So I expect him to be pretty popular and with good reason. The real contrarian thing in this stack is playing Alex Smith. Alex Smith has struggled so far this season as far as the fantasy point production goes. The best scoring week he's had all year was in week 1 where he put up 32 points against the San Diego Chargers. His second highest scoring fantasy day on the year was just a few weeks ago against the Tampa Bay Bucks where he only put up 20 fantasy points. So this week, I think he's going to have a pretty good game. He has a very favorable matchup against this Atlanta Falcons team. The Falcons are allowing the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks in the NFL right now at 25.4. So pairing that with Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce also has a pretty good matchup. The Falcons are actually 7th worst against tight ends in fantasy points per game allowed at 15 exactly. So these two together is going to be hopefully a low-owned stack for sure, but also a really, really cheap stack. So you could do some crazy things with your lineup. So I definitely think I'm considering these guys in tournaments, and hopefully they're going to be really low-owned, like I said, because I think there's a ton of sexier picks, as the industry likes to say, better than these guys. So hopefully they can put together a really good game because it looks like they're in a pretty good spot to do so. So at running back this week, I really wanted to emphasize that $6,000 to about $5,000 range right now because I think that majority of people are going to be playing Le'Veon or David Johnson and are really going to have to kind of look at this middle tier running back spot for the RB2 or even their flex spot. So I really wanted to kind of highlight some of these guys. I already talked about Theo Riddick, who is also in that range. But these three guys are definitely some people you need to consider because first off, Doug Martin actually has a pretty good matchup here, and I think Doug Martin is by far the best running back of these three. That said, he's still trying to get his feet under him coming back from injury. And, he hasn't had favorable matchups the past few weeks. This week is definitely a good matchup for him. San Diego's allowing the third most fantasy points per game to running backs at 28.3. They've actually allowed the second most receptions to running back at 78. Doug Martin's not usually a guy who gets a ton of targets, but he does get a fair share usually. He hasn't really gotten too involved in the passing game since coming back from that injury. But all three of these guys have had at least 20 touches in the past 2 games, and Martin and Booker have actually had over 25 touches in the past 2 games. So I think Booker is definitely a good option as well, because especially if Bibbs doesn't play, which I haven't heard for sure yet, but if Bibbs doesn't play, I think Booker could turn into somewhat of a popular play, especially against going up against his Jacksonville defense. So, and Hyde is usually not a guy that I don't play because he doesn't get involved in the passing game that much. But Carlos Hyde actually has the most targets out of these three running backs in the last 3 weeks at 9. So, there's really one right or wrong answer in this situation. I think Theoretic is probably going to be the most popular out of the guys in this range, and there's definitely guys in the $6,000 plus range that I like more than these 3 players. That said, I think you may have to play one of these guys because of their price. So definitely consider one of these players, and go ahead and let me know what you guys think is the best play down in the comments section. All right, so moving to some wide receivers now. First up, we have Mike Evans, and this guy's been one of the more consistent and reliable wide receivers on the board week in and week out, and his price reflects that because $8,600 is the most expensive that Mike Evans has been all season. And honestly, it makes perfect sense why, because in the last 9 out of 10 games, he has double-digit targets, he has 9 touchdowns, and out of those 9 games, 4 of them were 100 receiving yard games or more. So this makes perfect sense why this price is the way it is, and I definitely think that it's not too much for him. And we can add in the fact of the matchup against the San Diego Chargers. I will say that Chargers have been better in the passing defense game recently. That said, they're still allowing a lot of passing yards. They're allowing the 7th most passing yards in the NFL at 271.3 yards per game. And I think Mike Evans is one of those few guys that you can say is borderline matchup proof. We saw it last week. He had a tough matchup last week against the Seattle Seahawks and still was able to put up a relatively good game, had 2 receiving touchdowns, and still did what we usually see Mike Evans do just about every week. So adding all those things, then I think Mike Evans is still a really, really solid pick this week. All right, so next up I have Terrell Williams, and he's going to be facing off against Mike Evans and the Buccaneers this coming week. And I think Terrell Williams is a really interesting play this week for a couple of different reasons. So number one, he's played really, really well the past 3 weeks. He actually has 32 targets over the past 3 games, and he has 1 receiving touchdown in each of those 3 games. So he's obviously playing very, very well. He's definitely developed into Phillip Rivers' favorite target, especially with Travis Benjamin not playing like we saw him earlier in this season. So we've really seen Williams develop into the guy that we were really hoping he could be earlier in the season. That said, I think we could see Terrell Williams actually a little bit lower owned than expected because of how well the Buccaneers defense played last week against the Seattle Seahawks. So, I think Terrell Williams is a good play. I think we could see him a little bit lower owned. He is actually the most expensive he's ever been on DraftKings, which is interesting, but at $6,100, he's still not overpriced by any means, in my opinion. So he's only $100 more than he was last week, and last week he had 14 targets and 8 receptions for a receiving touchdown against the Houston Texans, who actually have a pretty good secondary over there. So I think this is a pretty good matchup for him, and I'm going to be looking at him in tournaments for sure. All right, so the final wide receiver that I have down here is Tyreke Hill, and he's one of the rare guys that I put in my video that I am super, super skeptical on whether to play or not. Honestly, I kind of just wanted to put him in here because I knew I'd probably get a lot of questions on him if I didn't. And there's not really that many wide receivers under the 5K mark this week that I'm super interested in and kind of have the upside that Tyreke Hill has. And, last week we saw him do something that hadn't been done since like in the 60s with Gale Sayers, I think it was. So obviously very, very impressive. And honestly, the way that the Chiefs are using Tyreke Hill actually reminds me a lot of how the Rams are using Tavon Austin, sort of, in the sense that they're going to throw a lot of screens to him, a lot of balls behind the line of scrimmage, and a lot of passes only 2 or 3 yards downfield, and kind of just hope they can get him in the open field and let him use his speed to his advantage and see if he can break one free. Without a doubt, I think Tyreke Hill is significantly better than Tavon Austin, especially at doing what they're trying to do, but I just don't know if I want to play him. But I probably will have to play him, especially at this price in cash games. So I don't know. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys are thinking about Tyreke Hill. Are you going to fade him? Are you going to play him in tournaments only? Are you going to play him in cash only? You know, what is your mindset? Because right now I'm completely torn on this player, and I have no idea what to do with him. So I'm interested in what you guys are thinking. All right, so finishing up here with a couple of tight ends and a defense. First up, we have Ebron, and if you haven't noticed a trend in this video yet, I'm talking about quite a few tournament plays, and Ebron is exactly that. So first off, last week he let down a plethora of people against the Minnesota Vikings on Thanksgiving Day with just 1 target and 0 fantasy points put up. Just a pathetic performance out of him, and for that very reason, I think he could be a little bit lower owned in this game than usual, especially going up against the Saints. This is a great spot for him, and honestly, you can play anybody on either side of the ball. I talked about it earlier. This game should be really, really high scoring. I'd be shocked if it wasn't, but I mean, crazier things have happened. So, but Ebron is definitely a really, really good option. You know, before the Thanksgiving Day game, he had put up 16 points in back-to-back games, and he had played pretty well. I mean, he was averaging more and more targets each week. You know, he was flirting with 100-yard receiving bonus every game. So, I mean, the guy was definitely someone that Stafford was looking to throw the ball to, but just for some reason he just didn't get that involved. I haven't really went back and watched that game. I don't really know what specifically happened, but in real time, it just looked like he just wasn't getting open, I guess. So. But Ebron is definitely a good option this week, and he's someone that I'm going to be taking a look at purely based on the fact of who he's facing, and I think he could be a little bit lower on because he just killed everybody's lineup last week in the Thanksgiving Day slate. All right, so next up I have Vance Mcdonald, and he's kind of an interesting play because in the past 5 games, he's had at least 6 targets. In 3 of those 5 games, he's put up at least 10 points, and he actually has a pair of receiving touchdowns in that span as well. So he's actually been somewhat of a reliable guy for Colin Kaepernick to throw to lately. So definitely interesting there. I like the price. He's definitely not going to be very highly owned because he's a San Francisco 49er, and that alone is going to lower his ownership. And going up against the Chicago Bears this week, I mean, as far as tight ends that the Bears have faced, haven't faced that many good ones. And in fact, the Bears have only given up 3 touchdowns to 2 tight ends this season. And those were, one was to Trey Burton, one was to Dwayne Allen, and the third one was to Cameron Brate. So it's not like they've had really, really good tight ends on the opposite side of the ball facing them. So, I mean, I think I may take a chance on Mcdonald in a couple of different lineups. He's extremely, extremely cheap. And I think he may be worth the risk in a handful of lineups. So for my defense this week, I like the Miami Dolphins for a couple of different reasons, even though they're going to be on the road in Baltimore this week. First off, Joe Flacco has thrown 6 interceptions in his last 5 games. The Ravens are averaging almost 1.5 giveaways per game, which is in the lower half of the league. And I like the price for this defense. And Miami has been playing very, very well as a team these past few weeks. So adding all that together, and I think Miami is actually a pretty good defense pick this week. Alright, so that's going to do it for this week's video. As always, be sure to follow me on Twitter for updates throughout the week. Be sure to look for my sleeper/value picks video on Friday, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Later.